First, just hello, everybody. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining today. If you haven't met before, I'm Rachel Murphy. I am the NPMS Volunteer Manager. And today's session, as we can see from the slideshow, will be on the BSBI Plant Atlas 2020 with Kevin Walker, who you should all be able to see as well. And Kevin's the Head of Science at the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And BSBI, of course, is a partner within the National Plant Monitoring Scheme project, and this webinar actually forms part of our ongoing programme of webinars and events. So if this is the first time that you've joined one of these events, please do take a look at our website and see if there are any other upcoming webinars and events that you might be interested in getting involved with. So as I say, welcome, especially to anybody who's new to the scheme or just interested and hoping to find out a bit more. But I shall now hand over and let Kevin take over with the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry not to be able to see you all, but I suppose that's the way with Zoom presentations these days. So as Rachel said, you might recognise me from the NPMS. I've been involved with NPMS right since the early days. I was involved in the sort of design and the launch of it. So I'm obviously heavily involved with NPMS, but today I'm sort of talking about my day job, which is the Head of Science at the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, where I work. I'm mainly sort of focused on data management, but also the sort of design and coordination and analysis of national recording and monitoring schemes. And so obviously Plant Atlas 2020 is our most sort of significant scheme that we've run over the last couple of decades. And I've been sort of involved in that for the last 10 years. It's sort of completely taken over my life for the last decade. So anyway, I'm just going to give you a sort of an overview of the project, just talk a little bit about the background to it, just explain the methods, and then I'll just give you some of the sort of main findings that came out of the project. If we have time, I'll also give you a demo of the website, because we've obviously got this lovely Plant Atlas book, but also there's a website that you can go on where all the information's available on that website for free. So if we've got time, I'll give you a little sort of 5-minute demo of the website. And then obviously, as Rachel said, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat and hopefully we'll have time to sort of go through some of those towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so first of all, I just want to pay tribute to my co-authors. Plant Atlas 2020 was a huge project and it couldn't be done by one person. And these are some of the colleagues, well, they're the co-authors on the Plant Atlas book. So the two on the left are from the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. So we have Pete Stroh on the left, who he was the sort of main organizer of the survey and brought all the information together. He was essentially the sort of chief nagger of the project and kept it all sort of going. And then the guy in the blue shirt to the right of him is Tom Humphrey, who was the sort of data whiz. So we assembled about 30 million records for the project, and it was sort of his job to sort of bring it all together and make sense of it. And he did an incredible job. And then it's worth saying it was a collaborative piece of work with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So the two guys on the right were heavily involved. The guy in the sort of blue blazer is Ollie Pescott, who you might know from NPMS. He was the sort of statistical whiz behind the sort of analysis that was done for Plant Atlas, and I'll just talk about some of the findings that he sort of came up with. And then the guy in the white shirt on the right is Rich Birkmar, who basically designed and developed the amazing website, which I'll sort of come on to as well in a bit. Okay, so we launched the Plant Atlas on the 8th of March last year. Seems a long time ago now, but yeah, so we had an online launch, and there was sort of 3 main things we launched on that day. So obviously on the left here, we have this wonderful 2-volume book published by Princeton University Press, along with the BSBI, and with this wonderful front cover painted by Chris Thorogood from the Oxford Botanic Garden. And if you've not seen this book, It's a fairly weighty tome. It sort of comes in at a couple of thousand pages and it weighs 8.5 kilograms. So if you're thinking of buying it, you need a lot of room on your shelves and some fairly robust shelves as well to hold the weight as well. So that's the sort of that was the sort of core output from the project. Alongside that, we also produced a couple of summary reports, mainly sort of just a sort of high level summary of the data. And we did two, one for Britain and one for Ireland. And the Irish one was also translated into Gaelic. And their sort of high level summaries would give all the background to the project and also the sort of key findings. And both of those are downloadable for free from the Plant Atlas 2020.org website. And then obviously we put everything that was in the book went onto the website at that address. In fact, that actually includes more information that was than was in the book. So if you go on the website, it actually includes information for about 700 extra non-native species, which we just didn't have room for in the book. We'd probably have needed a third volume, and 2 volumes was probably enough. So that website, I'll try and give you a demo of it later, but it's free to access and it's got a huge amount of information on there. It's all free and it's sort of relatively easy to sort of find your way around. Okay, so then we had following that sort of launch day, we had a series of launch events around the country in Cambridge, Newcastle, Belfast, Dublin, and Edinburgh. And here's our CEO, Julia Hamner, just opening the sort of event down in Cardiff in Wales. And all the events were very well attended. It was good to see a lot of our recorders there, but we also had press and also some politicians and things attended the events. And another highlight was some of our volunteers made these amazing cakes, which were sort of happily consumed at those events. And we got quite a lot of coverage in the media. You may have come across some of this on the day. So all the sort of main broadsheets covered the sort of main findings, and the thing they seem to have sort of focused in on was more than half of native plants have declined since the 1950s, which, there's an awful lot more to Plant Atlas, but that was the sort of main headline that sort of came out in the day, and that was picked up by all the main sort of big broadsheet papers. We also got on Radio 4 on the Today programme, and Here's My Ugly Mug on BBC News Live. They sort of had a couple of minutes on it, which was a very scary experience. But probably my highlight was we also got in the Good Week, Bad Week column in the Week Junior. And if any of you are parents, you might be familiar with that magazine. But my kids were completely unimpressed by the whole Plant Atlas thing. But when they saw that it got into the Good Week, Bad Week, they sort of suddenly had sort of new respect from them. Okay, so I'm sort of assuming you haven't seen the Plant Atlas or you don't know what it is. So what does it really tell us? And this slide just sort of summarizes the sort of 3 main things that it includes. So obviously it's an atlas, and the core of the information that's in the atlas are distribution maps. So here on the left we've got the distribution map for bee orchid, and for our purposes in the BSBI, we map the distributions with these dots, and these dots just represent the occurrence of that species within a 10 by 10 kilometre grid square of the OS national grid. So that's the sort of core of the atlas. So there's 3,500 maps in there, and just mapping out the sort of distribution at that scale. So the Plant Atlas 2020 is the 3rd distribution atlas we've done. So we had the first one, which was actually the first dot distribution atlas ever published anywhere in the world, and that was published in 1962. And then we had another one in 2002. So we've got a really good time series of information on distribution over time. So we can analyze that data and start to develop trends for species. So that's the sort of second main sort of bit of information that's sort of the key to the whole project. And we can sort of summarize that in terms of whether a species is declining or its distribution is stable or it's increasing. And you can see that for bee orchid, this is sort of back in the 1950s. And these are the sort of median, the sort of a proxy for a measure of distribution over that time, and you can see that it's been increasing, in particular since the 1990s, and I'll come on to that, the reasons for that later in this webinar. And then the sort of third main aspect to the project, which is sort of equally as interesting as the sort of distribution and the change, is the information on ecology. So if you look on the website or in the book, you'll see there's lots of information, particularly on the sort of habitats of all the species, and that's been sort of assembled by experts. All the captions are written by experts. So there's a huge amount of information on the sort of ecology of the species. And we also, in Plant Atlas, you'll see there's quite a lot of information on phenology, and that's never really been sort of assembled in this way in a distribution atlas before. So we've presented a lot of information on both the leafing and the flowering phenology. So those of you who know bee orchids, they overwinter as a rosette, and all this information is sort of summarized on this bar here, which shows the sort of leafing phenology and also the flowering times as well. Okay, so how many species did we cover? Well, we did all the native species, so there's around about 1,600 natives. We didn't include some of the more sort of obscure micro species of dandelions and hawkweeds and brambles, but every other native species that occurs in the wild and has done for many tens or hundreds of thousands of years, such as purple saxifrage, was covered. So we had 1,600 of those. We also included around about sort of nearly 2,000 non-native species. So, and we divide these into ancient introductions, what are termed archaeophytes, such as common poppy. So these are species that were probably introduced by Neolithic farmers, and they've been here for a very long time, but they're definitely human introductions. And a lot of those have declined, and I'll come on to that in a bit. And so there was 161 of those included. And then we have neophytes, much bigger sort of pool of species. And these tend to be ornamental plants, such as American skunk cabbage, which have been introduced in more modern times. And the strict definition of the difference between an archaeophyte and a neophyte is that an archaeophyte was introduced before 1500 and the discovery of the New World. And neophytes have been introduced to Britain or Ireland since 1500. So it's essentially as trade expanded and we moved out across the world and we started bringing species back, they tend to be the neophytes, and particularly ornamental plants that have been brought in, or horticultural trees. And then also we included around about 250 hybrids, which was a relatively new feature of this atlas compared to previous ones. And that's largely because the BSBI had a big focus on hybrids after the publication of the last atlas. So there was an awful lot of information. And it includes, I was trying to think of hybrids that people would be familiar with, and that because they're generally not very common, but possibly the one that people are most likely to see is the garden hybrid bluebell. Which is basically a garden cultivar between a Spanish bluebell and an English bluebell. So we had 3,500 species covered, all with maps on the website and in the book. And just to put that into context, so this chart here just shows the number of species covered by the Plant Atlas in comparison to other atlases that have been published for other groups over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. So you can see here the Atlas of Bryophytes and larger moths, published in recent years, about 3 times the numbers of species as those. The Bird Atlas, published in around about 2011-12, that covers 300 species. So we did 10 times the numbers of species in the Bird Atlas. And then the Butterfly Atlas, published just after, not long after 2000, and yeah, about 70 times the number of species there. So you can just see the sort of scale of the job that we undertook when we started this project. And as I said before, this is the third atlas of the British and Irish flora. So the first one published in 1962 by Franklin Perring and Max Walters. And as I said before, that was the first ever distribution atlas that used dot distribution maps anywhere in the world, and it was subsequently used for many other groups, been used for many other groups in lots of other countries. Then we had the new atlas in 2002, and then obviously Plant Atlas in 2020. So this graph here just shows the numbers of native and non-native species covered. So you can see with the natives, a little bit of an increase over time as we've discovered new species or described new species. So it's gone up from sort of around 1400 up to 1600. So not a huge amount of change across the three atlases, but when we come to the non-natives, there's been a huge increase in the coverage. So back in 62, there was only a couple of hundred non-native species covered, and now we're looking at, well, probably more non-natives than native species. And that's largely due to the increased sort of interest in recording non-native species. So back in the 60s, botanical recording was only really taking off. So I think people just had enough trouble just trying to identify the natives, and many of the sort of standard floras of the day didn't include many of these sort of garden ornamentals that were escaping into the wild. And also there wasn't really the interest from a sort of an environmental concern about these species becoming invasive in the wild. So, but by the second atlas in 2002, and obviously this one, the sort of standard floras were now covering many, many more non-natives, and there was a general increase within the recording community to sort of record these species. And that was largely out of just curiosity, because I think if you see things in the wild and you don't know whether they're native or non-native, you still want to record them. But it was also a definite worry that some of these species were causing problems for native species. So that was a sort of big shift across the three sort of atlas recording projects. When it comes to natives, we sort of think the British and Irish flora is super well recorded, and it is. But since 2000, we've had around about, it's 44 species have been discovered as new to Britain and Ireland, which is phenomenal, really, given that, you know, the amount of times that the flora has been sort of scrutinized and sort of picked over. And probably the most amazing find, I mean, I'm still quite it just still seems like an incredible find, is the Kerry mousetail fern shown here on the left of this slide. So this was found by a group of biologists in 2019, just before the deadline for record submission for the atlas. So it just got into the atlas. And these biologists initially thought it was a bryophyte. They didn't know what it was. But eventually sort of one of the biologists was a fern expert, and he realized that this was a neotropical fern, that basically its distribution is in mainly in the Caribbean, in the cloud forests in the Caribbean, in Cuba and Dominican Republic. So it was an astonishing find. I mean, you would not have predicted this species appearing in Europe, given its sort of, given that where its sort of original distribution was. So yeah, so that was probably overlooked. I mean, it's a tiny little thing. You can sort of see it's growing. I think that might be a Hymenophyllum there, Hymenophyllum tumbrigense, which was, I think, what people were looking for when they found it. So it's a tiny little fern, and yeah, new to Britain and Ireland and Western Europe. So that was an amazing find. Another amazing find was this species in the middle here, tongue orchids, Serapius lingua. There had been a few sort of odd records before, sort of historically, but in sort of 2017, a really big population of this was found in Essex near Tiptree, and there's still a little bit of a question mark over whether it was native, or it's just been a colonist from Europe, or maybe it's been planted. But this species seems to be spreading a lot in sort of, it's a Mediterranean species. It's spreading north within Europe, so it's probably a natural colonist. And certainly this is the sort of species we might expect to spread into Britain. over the coming decades with climate change. And then we had, so these are not essentially discoveries on the right here. These are species that have been newly described. So they've probably been known for quite a long time, but a name has never been put to them. And a big group of the newly discovered species are the white beams. And that's largely down to work by Tim Rich and his sort of co-workers down in the southwest. I think they've named about 25 new species in the last 20 years. And this one here is Margaret's whitebeam, which is named after Margaret Bradshaw of Teesdale fame, who found it with her husband Michael Proctor in North Devon. So there's a whole host of white beams, and if you're interested in white beams, there's a very good BSBI handbook that can help you to identify them.
Kevin, am I okay to jump in with a question?
Yep, far away.
Got a really good one already, actually, that relates to what you've just been saying there. When you look at changes in long-term trends for individual species, how do you account for sort of variation in the amount of recorder effort between this sort of different time periods?
Yep. So I was going to come on to that. Yeah, I've got a bit of an explanation for that that's coming up in a few slides. So
You hold the
if you
space.
can hold this one, I think it's it's definitely a big issue, and I'll talk a little bit about Ollie's work to sort of try and account for that. So
Oh,
yeah,
thank you.
okay, yeah. So I mean, anyone who's been following British botany for the last sort of 20 years probably knows this story. So must be Britain's rarest plant. So this is the ghost orchid Epipodium aphyllum, which it's, a lot of people think that the lady slipper orchid is the rarest, but I think this is probably justifiably the rarest plant. It's essentially a subterranean orchid that sort of tends to live under the leaf litter and in the soil, and very occasionally it sort of pops its head up. And this graph here just shows the number of records that we have in the BSBI database, and you can see that there's remarkably few records for this species over the last sort of 100 years. There was a sort of spate of sightings in the 70s and 80s when there was some sites near Marlow and places like that where it appeared, and it seemed to sort of persist for quite a while, but then it just disappeared. In the late 80s, it sort of disappeared, and it wasn't seen again until 2009, when it was recorded in a wood in Herefordshire, thought to be extinct, but actually it was only found because there's a group of botanists who go out every year and they stake out old ghost. They're so desperate to see ghost orchid that they will actually spend hours, days, weeks at the right time of year searching out sort of historic sites in the hope that one day they'll see it. And one of those people was very lucky in 2009, and he managed to find it in this wood in Herefordshire, just at the point as which it was being officially declared extinct. But it's a sort of species it's very difficult to say that it's extinct because it generally lives underground, so it probably still is there. It's just that the conditions that allow it to flower are so rare in our country that it just doesn't. It's not very often that it does flower, and even when it does flower, it's almost impossible to find. So it probably is still with us, but you'll see that most people sort of say it's extinct. Okay, so now I'll just say a little bit about how we sort of undertook the survey, and I'll come on to the sort of accounting for sort of recorder effort in a minute. So essentially, all the recording was carried out by volunteers, and this was coordinated by our vice county recorders. So the diagram on the left hand side here just shows we divide up the country into vice counties. So there's 111 in Britain and 40 in Ireland. Each one of those has one or more vice county recorder, and it was sort of their job to coordinate the recording for that vice county and basically cover all the 10-kilometre grid squares shown on the diagram in the middle. So there's nearly 3,000 in Britain and 1,000 in Ireland. So essentially they collate records for those 10-kilometre grid squares. Okay, so the survey started in 2000 and it finished at the end of 2019, so 20 years of recording. It's very difficult to say how many people were involved, but our sort of best estimate is about 8,500 botanists, or people are, yeah, I mean, which is phenomenal, really. Given that, you know, we rely on, you know, these people to sort of go out and do this in all weathers. Absolutely incredible. And it's almost impossible to estimate the amount of time that was put in, but it's hundreds of thousands of hours of recording, you know, and we can't really put a price on it because it was just such a major sort of achievement. It would be in, you know, millions and millions of pounds if we had to sort of pay for this stuff. So absolutely incredible achievement. So yeah, we had 30 million records collected during that 20-year period for the sort of 3,500 species that we mapped. So that was the sort of recording phase, which ended at the end of 2019. And then the group who I showed before, we had 3 years of basically checking the data, checking the maps, trying to put status on the maps. And then there was also 3,500 captions to write, sort of species captions, which luckily we had a lot of captions from the last atlas published in 2002, but they required a lot of editing and updating. So it was a huge job. And then obviously we had all the analysis to undertake and sort of try and get that, you know, get that all finished. So we, yeah, so yeah, it was a phenomenal achievement, and I still haven't recovered from all the work. Okay, so now to come on to the you know, the change. How do we measure change, and how do we account for the variation in recorder effort across those three sort of atlas recording time periods? So here they are. Here are the three atlases, and these are what we use to measure that change. So you can take the distribution maps from each of those atlases. So again, we've got bee orchid here. So this is the one in 1962, 2002, and then 2020. So you can see back in the 60s, bee orchids sort of hugging the chalk here on the North and South Downs. Pretty, you know, you can and in the Chilterns, but quite scattered further north and probably on a lot of the limestones. By 2002, you can see that it's very hard to that sort of definition of the chalk and the limestone is starting to break down as this species is being recorded further away from those areas, and you can just see it starting to spread along the coasts in North and South Wales, and also up here in sort of Northumberland. So that sort of hugging of the calcareous geology is starting to break down as this species is spreading out. And then we get to 2020, and you've completely lost that. It's almost a ubiquitous species in the sort of south and east of England. You know, it's further spread along the coasts, particularly up here in northern England into Northumberland. Also spreading sort of up the west side of Cumbria, and also here it's starting to colonise Scotland. I think the first record in Scotland was in 2002. So yeah, you can say it's definitely increasing, but what I could have showed you a slide which showed the increase in the number of records, and there's been a phenomenal increase in the number of records between these three atlas periods. So what you have to be able to do in your analysis is to say, regardless of that increase in recording effort, is this species increasing and declining? And I I, I can't really go into the detail of how we did that. I think you need Ollie Pescott did the work, but they used quite a sophisticated sort of modeling procedure to take that raw distribution data and then to account for recorder effort. Essentially, they took species that would have been well recorded throughout that period because they're very easy to identify and they're very common, things like Yorkshire fog or bluebells, and they use those as benchmarks so for each 10-kilometre grid square you could say how well or badly a particular hectad had been recorded, and then when you look across all of them you sort of correct for that level of recording across all the hectads that species is recorded in, and then you you correct whatever the change in the hectare distribution is, you correct for that difference in recording effort based on those local benchmarks. It's quite a complicated process, and if you want to read more about it, there's the introductory chapter to the atlas is available for free on the BSBI, on the plantatlas.org website, and it's all explained in there. But essentially, when you've done all that sort of analysis, you end up with this sort of graph here on the left, which is just a time series. So these markers are just the corrected relative distributions for each of the atlas recording periods. So you've got the 62 atlas here, the 2002 atlas here, and then we divided the 2 decades in the current atlas there. So, and they're just plotted at the median points for the recording period. So that gives you your sort of averaged out sort of change over time, taking into account these differences in recording effort. And then as part of this statistical modeling approach called Frescalo, you then fit lots of lines that are compatible with that distribution, and you just take 100 of them at random, and that gives you the sort of indication of whether the species is increasing, stable, or declining. So you can see for bee orchid, it's fitting all these lines through. They're all going in the same direction, and you've got fairly high confidence that that species has increased, irrespective of the increase in recording effort over those time periods. And then just to sort of display that in a more simple, to get to a sort of more simplistic metric or measure of change, this is just showing so this axis at the bottom here is just the slope. So down here you've got a negative slope, at the top end you've got a positive slope, and this sort of red line represents a species that was stable. So if it had a flat line, it would be sort of distributed around this line. So you can see that bee orchid, all those lines, the slope of those lines are at this end in the sort of positive increasing end. So we can convert those into a sort of more simplified metric where we just divide all that whole range into sort of, from a very strong decline to a strong increase. So you can see that we've classified it as a moderate increase based on all that sort of statistical wizardry. And then even for sort of illustrative purposes, we can have a very simplified trend bar, which just shows the sort of increase down here. And that's included on the website and in the book. So sorry, that's all a bit complicated, but we can maybe come back to that in the Q&A if people would find that sort of helpful. So now I'll just basically run through in a sort of an example account just to show you what is actually in the atlas. So this is the account for a species I'm very interested in, past flower Stilla vulgaris, which is a early flowering species that is almost entirely restricted to the chalk and limestone in the sort of southern half of Britain, and in the past it sort of got up onto the limestones in northern England as far as Piercebridge on Teesside, but it's pretty much extinct in the north of Britain now. That dot there is actually a site just out to the south of Leeds where there's only one flowering plant and a couple of seedlings, but it still gets a dot on the atlas. So we've got the sort of distribution map for this species, and it's just worth pointing out that we've got the blue dots, which are the sort of native, where we consider it to be native, and then we have the red dots as well, and that's differentiating the places that we know it's been introduced. And also the other thing to point out is the darker the dot, the more recent it's been recorded within that hectad. So you can see that there's still a scattering of dots, but around it there's a sort of historic shadow of dots where it used to occur, but probably hasn't been recorded for a very long time. So now that sort of information is summarized in the key just alongside the map. And then this goes alongside the map. So this is the species caption. And as I said before, it's usually written by an expert on the species. So that was in the first atlas, in the 2002 atlas, that was Roe Fitzgerald. And then I updated it for this atlas because I'd done quite a lot of work on this species and looking at why it's declined over the sort of last 60 years. So we have a nice little caption just summarizing its habitat, also the trends displayed in the atlas, and then where there is information, an explanation of why we think, what's underlying those trends. Often, if there's anything about its sort of taxonomy or its history of introduction, that's also included. And then there's always a bit of information on its sort of wider distribution in Europe. And there's a sort of link to key refs as well, which you can sort of access the sort of literature behind the species. It's quite a good summary of what's known about the species. And then on the right here, we obviously have the trend graphs that I've just been showing you. So you can see that there's two different types of trend graphs. So we've got the long-term trend, which takes you back to the start of the first atlas recording period, so the 1930s. But then we also have the short-term trend, which is essentially the change since the last atlas was published to this one. So you've got a sort of a picture of its historic change, and in the case of this species, a very strong decline since the 1950s, but also more recent changes. And sometimes those can be at odds. Sometimes you have a long-term trend which is actually changed in the more recent times. So it might be stable now, or it might have even increased in the last sort of recording period. And then if you look at the atlas or the website, you'll see some of these graphs, which are just, as I said before, are just summarizing some new information that we've never included within the atlases before. So this one on the left is the apparency. So this is just the distribution of the records that we have for pulsatilla in our database. So it's basically peaking at about the time it's flowering, but you can still see that there's records that go on throughout the year, and that's obviously because it's a wintergreen species, so you can technically go out and record it at any time of the year if you know what the leaves look like. And then we sort of summarize what's known about the phenology of the species in this sort of phenology bar. So the top orange line just shows you when it's in flower, and the bottom line is just when it's in leaf. And we assembled this information. I mean, this information is available in floras and things, but it had never been sort of brought together in one place. So it's quite a good place to go and find it if you're interested in sort of flowering or leaf phenology. And then this sort of graphic, we nicked this from the Bryophyte Atlas. So this is essentially the latitude, so distance north, and against altitude. So it's showing the sort of altitudinal range against latitude. So each of these latitudinal bands are 50-kilometer cells, and then it's going up in 100-meter cells, and then we're just plotting the distribution within those bands. So you can see that pulsatilla is obviously a lowland species. If you were talking about something like a high montane species, all these cells up here would be filled, but I'll show you some examples of that a bit later in the talk. Okay, so now I'll just talk a little bit about the sort of overall findings of the atlas. And as I said before, one of the things that a lot of people picked up was based on this graphic. So this is just really summarizing all that trend information about whether things were increasing, declining, or stable, and it's just sort of displaying this as a percentage for Britain. This doesn't include Ireland because we did Ireland separately. So now again, I'm just dividing it into natives, the ancient introductions, the archaeophytes, and the neophytes. So you can see for the natives, 53% of all our native species have shown a decline since the first atlas, so the 1950s. 33% stable and 14% are increasing, which is quite a depressing statistic to know that half of our native flora is in decline. But that's what the atlas showed, and that's the power of doing this sort of work. A similar picture for the ancient introductions, the archaeophytes. Here a bit higher, so 62% of all those archaeophytes are declining, only 15% are increasing. And then when we go to the neophytes, it's completely the other way around. So very few of them are declining. Most of them are actually increasing, which is, with anyone who's interested in invasive non-native species, that won't be a surprise. So just to sort of give you a bit of background to the sort of reasons, we don't know for certain. The data behind the atlas is all distribution. data, so we don't have a sort of cause and effect, but by looking at the sort of the types of species that are declining, we can start to sort of make some sort of broad conclusions about why that's so. And many of the species that are shown quite big declines were associated with heathlands or grasslands that we know have declined because of habitat loss, habitat destruction, and modification since the 1950s, largely through conversion to intensive agriculture, as well as sort of forestry and other things. And the two examples we gave here are harebell and heather, which, you know, are still relatively frequent species. You know, you wouldn't think that they were in trouble if you were out recording, but actually they have shown quite dramatic declines since the 1960s, which, you know, was apparent in the last atlas, but it's become more apparent with the findings of this atlas. And then I showed the sort of big decline in the archaeophytes. So a lot of these archaeophytes are arable weeds that were probably introduced by, you know, Neolithic farmers, you know, back in the Neolithic and onwards. So a lot of them are associated with sort of low intensity sort of agriculture, and obviously species such as corn marigold and cornflower have declined since the 1950s with increased use of herbicides and pesticides and things, and with the sort of introduction of more intensive cropping. So they show some of the most sort of dramatic declines of all the species we analysed. But it's worth sort of pointing out that some of these, like cornflower, are actually now increasing again. So they had that big historic decline to the sort of 1990s, but they're now increasing largely due to the sort of sowing of wildflower seeds, of annual sort of annual sort of weed mixes. So you can see here for cornflower that big decline, and then it's going up again. I mean, technically those new populations are not archaeophyte populations because they're not populations that have been there for hundreds or thousands of years. They're just sort of plantings on urban roadsides, or here, like here, this is in my local park in Panel up here near Harrogate, and this was basically sown a couple of summers ago. It's probably not there now. It's probably because they're not disturbing the soil. But yeah, it was a nice mix of cornflower, corn cockle, and corn marigold, plus a few other non-native herbs sort of thrown in for good measure. So they're probably not sustainable populations, but they're certainly increasing the sort of distributions of these species. Okay, and the other sort of worrying finding was the number of species that were appearing to decline for reasons that must be associated with climate change. And we had a few examples which are sort of high montane species, such as alpine ladyfern, which are showing quite rapid declines over quite a short period. And some of these species are sort of associated with sort of high montane environments, particularly snow patches. And we know from lots of work that the amount of snow is decreasing, these snow patches are disappearing, and obviously that's impacting the populations of these sort of species that rely on those sort of conditions. And I don't know if you follow a guy called Ian Cameron, but he's a sort of snow patch watcher, and he posts quite regularly about sort of Scottish snow patches. And I was following he kept going back to the Sphinx, which is one of the biggest snow patches in Scotland. It never used to disappear in the summer, but unfortunately in the last sort of 3 or 4 years it's just completely disappeared due to the sort of high summer temperatures. So we're definitely starting to see those sort of impacts at high altitude. And the sort of data we collect, it's very difficult to sort of pick up those sort of changes because a lot of these species are very localized. So you don't tend to sort of pick those changes up at a 10-kilometer grid square. You need to be looking at sort of population level sort of studies. And there are some studies that have shown things like snow pearl are declining, you know, when you actually look at a very small scale. But the fact that we're picking this up at a 10-kilometer scale is very worrying for some of these sort of high montane species. And then we've got some winners as well as losers in terms of climate change. And the species that I've used throughout this talk is the bee orchid, and it's a sort of personal favourite of mine. But that is definitely a winner from climate change, and it's definitely increasing. You know, it's occurring in all sorts of places that it never used to occur. It's even moving into new habitats that it never used to occur in, and this must be down to sort of warmer winters that's allowing those overwintering rosettes to survive, and then produce flowers the next year. And so it's just exploding. It's sort of spreading. It's spreading out. It's not just spreading out, you know, climatically across the country. It's filling in into all sorts of habitats it never used to occur in. And then there's a couple of examples here of other species that seem to be doing the same thing. So early meadowgrass, Poa infirma. I was reading something, I think it was Tim Rich the other day, was saying, oh, in the 1980s, he drove all the way down to Cornwall to see it and twitch it. But now you can find it, you know, I was walking through London recently and I saw it on a roadside in London. It's in Cambridge. It's sort of moved all the way up the east side of the country, and it's sort of spreading northwards. And that's another Mediterranean sort of species that we can expect to increase. And then this other species down here on the bottom left, mossy stonecrop, Crassula tilea. Again, in the sort of 80s and 90s, if you wanted to see that, you'd have to go to Breckland in East Anglia or the New Forest. But it's now sort of spread into Wales, northern Wales, and also in the eastern northeast of Scotland. I mean, there used to be some small populations there, but it's spread hugely in the last 20 years. And again, that's almost certainly due to sort of surviving because of warmer winters and fewer frosts. And then finally, the other sort of big group of winners are the neophytes, the sort of ornamentals that we've introduced to gardens and that are sort of spreading out from gardens, or have spread out of gardens in other countries and then have jumped over the sea and have managed to get here and are sort of spreading, such as this species down here, narrow-leaved ragwort Senecio iniquidens, which wasn't even mapped in the last atlas, but now is sort of has spread pretty much over the whole country in the last 20 years. And so these are mainly sort of garden throwouts that have they've escaped from gardens or they've been dumped in garden waste, and they're sort of establishing quite happily in the wild. And it has to be said, the vast majority of them are benign. They don't seem to be they're not really impacting the sort of native flora, but there are a few exceptions. And there's 4 on this slide, which have all got very, very dramatic increases in terms of the trends from the Atlas analysis. And actually, Sitka spruce, shown here on the top right, that's actually, I think that had the biggest increase of any species over both in Britain and Ireland. So, you know, these are species that are really, really increasing and causing all sorts of problems for our native flora. So American skunk cabbage over here on the top left, floating pennywort, which again was scarcely with us when the last atlas was published. It's now sort of spread into sort of 400-500 hectares across the country. And then down on the bottom right of the slide, New Zealand pygmyweed, which I'm just out with my son. He was fishing, and this is the sort of shoreline of our local gravel pit, and it's 100% cover of New Zealand pygmyweed. Whereas back in it was only first recorded there in the sort of early 1990s. So it's probably having a huge impact on the sort of aquatic flora there. Okay, so that's sort of it really. Just by way of conclusion, it's fair to say that if we didn't have volunteers, we wouldn't have Plant Atlas 2020. You know, it was all done by volunteers. Okay, we sort of came in at the end and put it all together and produced the book, but it was all down to the amazing volunteer workforce that, you know, we've got them to thank for it. And it obviously gives us an incredible snapshot of what the flora is like at the start of the 21st century, and probably more importantly, how it's changed since the middle of the 19th century as well. And obviously that's an amazing sort of piece of evidence for, policy conservation and research, and we're sort of hoping that it will get widely used for, all sorts of reasons. And we've just put all the data behind the atlas on a open source sort of portal where researchers or conservationists or whoever can go on and download the information and use it for their own purposes. And then the last thing to say is that we're also starting to think about the next one, which would probably happen in 2040. It's not going to be me that's involved, but we're sort of thinking ahead and starting to think about, what we need to put in place to sort of do this all again in 20 years' time. Okay, so and then I've just got this one last slide. So if you want to have a look at the website, you can access it at plantatlas2020.org. And if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, you can, if you go on the Princeton website, so princeton.press/plantatlas, you should be able to get a copy from there. Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. That was really was absolutely fascinating. I do have a couple of questions to ask you, but I would just say if you have any more, now's the time to pop them in to the Q&A area. I do have one question going back to the Kerry mousetail that you talked about a bit earlier on in the presentation. Somebody has asked, is that a recent introduction, do we think?
It's where it is. It's very unlikely to be an introduction because it's extremely remote part of the Killarney sort of peninsula down in the southwest of Ireland. So it's either always been there and it's been overlooked, or it has colonized. Ferns spread by spores and you can get spores of bryophytes or ferns colonizing over thousands of kilometers. So it's more likely that it's either overlooked or it's just sort of colonized because of climate change, possibly.
Yeah. And on to some of the species you were talking about towards the end there. We've got a question: what's the main problem with invasive neophytes? Is it that they are out competing other species?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the main issue. They just physically just take up space, and they just outcompete. In the case of the crassula, the New Zealand pigweed, it's basically invading a sort of vacant niche. So the edge of that gravel pit is usually just bare sand, but it's basically taking up, well, bare sand with sort of ephemerals that would normally grow there, but it just completely takes over. And the other thing that grows there are some quite interesting bryophytes as well. So these little rixias, which are you tend to get them on sort of ephemeral wet sort of habitats, and there's lots of those there. And we've looked for them since the crash. I mean, you just can't find them now. There's just no bare ground for them to sort of colonize. But some of these non-natives also potentially bring in viruses or pests and pathogens. But yeah, generally it's just the sort of physical competition.
Yeah. I can see we've got quite a few more questions, but only 5 more minutes left. You did mention at the start that you were planning to do a little bit of a demonstration. I don't know how much time you need for that, so I'm going to say no more questions. Sorry, everybody. If you do have any more questions, of course, please do email them, and we'll try and get back to you. But we're running out of time somewhat today. Have you got time for
I'm just trying
5 minutes for a demo? There are another couple of questions. I don't know if you're able to talk at the same time. Somebody's asked what the best app is or a website to recommend to casual observers who want to record something interesting they saw. Now, there's oodles out there. What I would say is we've done quite a nifty review of apps actually within I believe it was the newsletter on the NPMS newsletter in 2021, the summer newsletter, and that covers a review of different apps such as iRecord, PlantNet, various things. I don't know if you have a preference, Kevin, but that's certainly a review that's worth taking a look at, as I say, in the NPMS 2021 summer newsletter.
Sorry, I failed at multitasking there. Was that recording apps?
Do you have a preference for a casual?
Yeah, I mean,
an app for casual recorders.
So I use iRecord for for plants. If I'm just doing incidental recording, I mean, I find it's just really good if I just want to quickly sort of record something and post a photo. I'm doing fungi recording, and I find the iNaturalist app's very good because it's got photo recognition. So if you're struggling with identification, it can, it doesn't swear blind to giving you 100% definitive identification, but if you're sort of starting out, it's really good for getting you into the right sort of space in terms of what
Yeah.
species they are. So either iRecord or
That's the
iNaturalist.
tip that we always give,
Yeah,
isn't it? Never take them as
yeah,
certain, but they're really good at pointing in the right direction. And there are so many options out there. And I think everybody
yeah,
has their preference. For those that have asked questions, I think there's 2 or 3 that we haven't quite had a chance to answer. Please do email them to npmssupport.org.uk and we will get you answers.
yep. Do you want me to do a quick
If
demo? Yeah.
that's okay,
So
thank you.
So this is the plantatlas2020.org website. So I'll just do it very quickly. So this is the home page. So it's just got a bit of background. Down here, there's some, it's where you can download those summary reports that I was talking about. There's a link to the actual book, links to the introductory chapters that you can download. So just have a play around there. But the main bit is this Atlas tab up here. So if we go to that, this is where you get the sort of meat. So you just type in your species here. So you can type in either a Latin name or a common name, and you just select your species, and you'll get the map and the caption here. So the caption on the right, you've got a summary of the trends here, and there's links to the sort of citations and things like that. And there's all sorts of things you can do with the mapping. So this is just a sort of standard map, but if you go to the zoomable, you can actually start to zoom in. So you can, if you're interested in a particular area, you can start to sort of drill down into where exactly it is against sort of place names. You can do that at higher resolution. So actually, no, you can't do that at tetrad. Sorry. There is an option to do tetrad somewhere, but I can't remember where it is. But anyway, some other maps that you can do, you can look at tetrad frequency. So this is just mapping so a tetrad is a 2 by 2 kilometer grid square, and it just shows you where the species is more abundant based on the number of tetrads within each hectad, which is quite funky. So you can start to see where it's more common. What else? You can look at change maps for a species, so you can see where it's colonized since the new atlas. So this is all these little orange triangles are where it's appeared since the last atlas. You can even compare back to the first atlas, so you get even more. So it's showing you the sort of where bee orchids basically colonized, and if it was declining, you'd see where it had been lost from as well. Yeah, so yeah, just have a play around. There's lots of other tabs here. There's a conservation tab which has got all the bits and bobs in terms of its conservation designation. There's photographs as well, lots of nice photographs. There's a whole section on trends, which you can drill down into. You can look at different countries, so Britain, Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales. So you can basically do all sorts of things. So you can also look at long or short-term trends. So that's the short term, and you can download anything. So if you want to download any of these or the maps or anything, you can just download it. And then finally, there's the phenology page. So again, as I said, you've got lots of information on apparency and phenology, and then there's the altitude as well on that. So yeah, just have a play, see what you think.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kevin. What an absolutely fantastic resource. Obviously, publicly, freely available. And funnily enough, as somebody has rightly said, you've thanked the volunteers, but they thank the Atlas because it's got them out into all sorts of places they wouldn't have otherwise gone to. So thank you very much. And to echo quite a few of the comments in chat as well, thank you for such a great talk, Kevin. I can see that it is now gone 1:30. As I say, this has been recorded, so we will be popping it up on the NPMS support YouTube channel in due course if you want to go and refer back to it another time. So brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.